Hey guys, tonight we begin with something quiet. Not the clash of armies or the shouting of kings, but the soft rustle of parchment, the dim flicker of oil lamps, and the slow heartbeat of a city that would not let itself fade into memory. Tonight's story is not about the loud victories that fill the pages of history books. It's about stillness, about endurance, and about how sometimes survival itself can feel like the most impossible triumph. Before we drift into this tale, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, so these forgotten corners of the past can keep reaching you where you are. And in the comments, share the exact time and place you're listening. It's always beautiful to see how these tiny threads of history stretch quietly across the world, binding all of us together in this moment. So now, let's sink back into the candlelight of another time, where a city stood alone, against all odds. The empire should have ended 1,000 times. By all rights, its story should have been buried under the dust of forgotten kingdoms, its name whispered only in the cracked libraries of monks, or in the fading maps of weary travellers. Yet somehow, against every logic, Byzantium lingered. It was like an ember at the edge of a dying fire, glowing faintly, almost swallowed by ash, but never truly extinguished. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, when barbarians poured into cities once thought eternal, it was Constantinople that still held its breath. The marble domes shone, the walls stretched unbroken, and the people whispered of Rome not as a memory, but as a living thing. For centuries, they called themselves Romans, even though the old city of Rome had long since fallen into ruin. To the Byzantines, Rome was not a place. Rome was an idea, and ideas, unlike stones, do not fall so easily. The story of Byzantium is not one of constant glory, far from it. It is the story of decline, despair, and then, miraculously, resurgence. At every corner of its history, the empire seemed ready to collapse, and yet it clung on. It bent, it cracked, but it did not break. And in that stubbornness, in that refusal to fade, lies the heart of what some call the greatest comeback in history. Imagine the city of Constantinople in the years after the West was lost. The streets were still alive with merchants selling silks from the east and oils from the Mediterranean. Candles burned before mosaics of Christ and the Virgin, their golden tesserae flickering with divine light. Ships crowded the harbours, their sails like wings spread against the sea winds. But beneath this splendour lay fear. Enemies gathered on every side, the Persians in the east, Slavs and Avars pushing from the north, and then an even greater storm, the rise of Islam, sweeping across lands the Byzantines had once called their own. It seemed impossible that this empire, hemmed in and battered, could survive. But survive it did. Part of its strength lay in its geography. Constantinople was not just a city, it was a fortress built by nature and man alike. Nestled between the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn, it was wrapped in water on 3 sides, and where land approached, walls rose higher than any army could hope to scale. Not just one wall, but 3, layer after layer of stone and mortar, towers and battlements, a shell that turned the city into something almost immortal. An army could break itself to pieces on those defences, and many would try. But walls alone do not keep an empire alive. Inside those walls lived a people who had learned how to endure. Byzantium was not a land of sudden victories or reckless charges. It was a land of patience, strategy, and survival. Where others crumbled under the weight of defeat, Byzantium found ways to endure it, to transform weakness into time bought, and time into hope renewed. Think of the emperors who walked those halls of marble, Some were tyrants, others saints, many merely desperate men clinging to a throne that seemed to shift beneath them. Yet even when emperors fell, blinded, murdered, exiled, the empire itself remained. Power passed like a torch through trembling hands, but the flame was never snuffed out. This was no accident. Byzantium had something the crumbling West lacked: a system that adapted. Its bureaucracy was vast and meticulous, its tax collectors relentless, its record keepers precise. It was a machine of parchment and ink, as much as swords and shields, and it gave the empire a kind of endurance that barbarians at the gates could not easily erase. A Gothic king might burn a city, a Frankish chieftain might seize land, but when the dust settled, Byzantium still had clerks, still had coinage, still had the structure of an empire intact. And so, like a wounded animal retreating into its shell, it endured. But endurance was not merely about survival, it was about belief. The Byzantines carried within them a sense of destiny. They believed themselves chosen, not only heirs to Rome, but guardians of Christianity itself. In their eyes, Constantinople was not just a capital, it was the new Rome, the shining city of God's will on earth. When plagues came, when enemies burned the countryside, when even the sea seemed to rise against them, they believed that Providence had spared them for a reason. And perhaps that belief itself was a weapon as powerful as their spears or their walls. Still, belief did not banish hunger. There were times when the people of Constantinople starved, when the grain ships did not come, when children cried in the streets and the shadows of famine darkened the city's proud mosaics. There were nights when fires raged, not from lamps or hearths, but from enemy torches hurled across the walls. There were decades when the empire lost more than it won, shrinking in size until it seemed a ghost of its former self. And yet, it refused to die. One cannot tell this story without speaking of the sea, for the sea was Byzantium's ally. Out of its waters came trade, wealth, and salvation. It was on the sea that Byzantine ships, armed with the mysterious weapon known as Greek fire, turned back enemies who thought themselves invincible. Imagine it: a dark night on the waves, hostile fleets advancing, when suddenly the Byzantine ships unleash streams of liquid flame, fire that clung to water, fire that could not be extinguished. Panic, screams, the burning wrecks of what had been mighty armadas. The empire's enemies learned to fear the sea, not because of its storms, but because of Constantinople's fire. The empire's story is not clean. It is not a tale of constant triumph. It is a tale of survival through compromise, through cunning, through faith and ferocity. It is the story of emperors who brokered peace when they could not afford war, of generals who fought delaying battles so the city could breathe another day, of citizens who rebuilt after each devastation. And slowly, painfully, with setbacks and blood, Byzantium found itself not only surviving, but preparing for its greatest resurgence. The empire's endurance is almost unnatural. When you consider how many times it should have ended, the sieges, the plagues, the betrayals, it feels as though something unseen carried it forward, as though fate itself refused to write the final line. Other empires rose like flames and fell into ashes. Byzantium smouldered, dimmed, flickered, but each time the wind threatened to snuff it out, it flared again. To call it the greatest comeback in history is not to exaggerate, for from the ashes of decline, Byzantium would rise again, reclaiming strength when all seemed lost. But in this first chapter of its long tale, it is enough to understand one truth. This was the empire that refused to die. And so, in the silent hours when Constantinople's lamps burned low, when its weary people prayed for mercy, when the air itself seemed heavy with despair. There was still something in the stones, in the walls, in the waters surrounding the city. A spirit that whispered, "Not yet, not yet." The world might shift, empires might crumble, and new powers might rise, but Byzantium, against reason, against probability, against the very weight of history, endured. And as long as it endured, the chance of resurrection lingered, waiting for the moment when ashes would give way to flame. It was not yet the time of glory, but it was not the end either. It was the waiting, the holding on, the slow heartbeat of a civilization that would, in time, surprise the world once more. Byzantium lived, and that was the beginning. Night gathers slowly over a city that refuses to sleep. From the highest towers of Constantinople, the horizon still holds the faint glow of a fading sun. Yet down in the streets, the lamps are already being lit, one by one, until the avenues shimmer like thin rivers of fire. The wind off the Bosphorus carries the sharp scent of salt and tar, and in the murmuring of the harbour, you can almost hear the heartbeat of an empire holding on against the dark. But shadows were lengthening, not just the gentle ones cast by twilight, but the heavier, unseen kind that settle across a people when their world begins to contract. Constantinople, for all its shimmering mosaics and vaulted churches, stood at a dangerous crossroads. The markets still bustled. The sound of merchants hawking spices still echoed beneath the domes. But in the quiet corners of the city, the mood had shifted. Whispers of enemies, of famines and lost provinces, carried more weight than the clang of coins. Centuries of pressure had worn the empire thin. From the east, the Persians still tested the frontiers, relentless and calculating. To the north, Slavic tribes swept through the Balkans, slipping past garrisons and leaving trails of fire in their wake. And now a new and unsettling force, swift as desert winds, swept across lands the Byzantines had once thought secure. The armies of Islam had erupted from Arabia, devouring Syria, Egypt, and much of the fertile East, with an energy that stunned even hardened soldiers. Antioch, Damascus, Alexandria, names once proud on imperial maps, fell one after another. Inside the capital, the shock was palpable. Each loss was not just a loss of territory, it was a wound to the empire's soul. These were not distant provinces. They were the breadbaskets, the Silk Roads, the heartlands of faith. Egypt's grain had fed Constantinople for generations. Now the supply ships came less frequently, their arrival a fragile thread between hunger and survival. Markets once fragrant with Egyptian wheat and Levantine figs grew quieter. Bakers stretched flour with husks. Children learned the taste of thinner bread. Yet daily life persisted, because it had to. The hippodrome still rang with cheers as chariots thundered across the track. Priests still swung censers heavy with incense before the golden icons of Hagia Sophia. Diplomats still scribbled letters on parchment and stamped them with imperial seals. The people of Constantinople carried on as if sheer routine could keep the world from crumbling. They walked under colonnades polished by centuries of feet. They prayed before mosaics, whose tiny stones reflected candlelight like captured stars. And they told themselves that the city of Constantine was untouchable, but the shadows did not care for marble, or mosaics. Beyond the mighty Theodosian walls, the empire's borders shifted like restless tides. The Danube frontier groaned under Slavic incursions. Armenian hill forts fell silent. Caravan routes that once carried silk and silver now lay in the hands of new masters. Even the sea, so often the empire's ally, brought uneasy news. Pirates, rival fleets, storms that battered the harbours and left merchants stranded. Inside the palace, the burden of rule weighed heavily. Emperors came and went with unsettling speed. Some wore the crown only long enough for their names to be stitched into banners before they were dragged into exile or buried in shallow graves. Ambition flared in the Senate halls, intrigue slithered through the corridors, and the clink of armour was as common in the courtyards as the echo of prayers. Stability was a fragile mask, easily cracked by rumour or betrayal. Still, Constantinople itself stood defiant. Its location was both gift and curse. Surrounded on three sides by water, guarded by a triple ring of walls, the city was a fortress of stone and faith. Siege after siege had broken against those defences, leaving behind fields of bones and burnt siege engines as silent testimony to their strength. Yet the people inside knew that even the strongest walls could not hold forever if the world beyond them continued to collapse. As the empire shrank, Constantinople became less a capital of wide dominions and more a solitary beacon, a single bright flame flickering in a widening darkness. Refugees streamed in from the lost provinces, farmers from Anatolia, traders from Syria, monks from Egypt, each carrying stories of defeat and hardship. Their voices filled the taverns and marketplaces, weaving a tapestry of grief that settled like a low cloud over the city. They spoke of deserts alive with horsemen, of ships captured on moonless nights, of villages where church bells had fallen silent. The newcomers brought not only tales but skills and ideas, and in this strange way, the empire's losses nourished its heart. Craftsmen from Antioch carved intricate stonework for the city's churches. Weavers from the Levant introduced new patterns to the looms. Scholars who had fled the burning libraries of the East carried with them scrolls and manuscripts, precious fragments of a learning that might otherwise have been lost. In their exile, these men and women enriched the very city that sheltered them, turning tragedy into a quiet, stubborn renewal. At night, when the sea winds cooled the stones and the lanterns flickered across the harbours, one could walk the terraces above the Golden Horn and feel both awe and unease. The city was beautiful beyond description, a place where the glow of moonlight turned domes into silver crescents and the water into black glass. But beneath that beauty lay tension. Patrols moved along the walls, their torches tracing slow arcs against the sky. Bells rang from distant churches, calling the faithful to prayers for deliverance. Even the gulls seemed restless, circling endlessly above the masts of ships anchored in the dark. The court theologians said the empire endured because God willed it so. They preached that Constantinople was chosen, that the Virgin herself watched over its towers and gates. And perhaps faith truly did play a part in the city's survival. But faith alone did not explain the careful diplomacy that brought temporary peace from one enemy so another could be fought. It did not account for the tireless work of engineers who strengthened the walls, or the merchants who risked pirate-haunted seas to keep grain flowing into the city's granaries. Survival here was not a miracle of heaven, but the relentless labour of men and women who refused to surrender. The shadows pressing in were not only armies and famines, they were the slow erosion of certainty. The Byzantines called themselves Romans, heirs to an empire that once ruled the known world. But with each lost province, each shattered alliance, the question grew harder to ignore. What did it mean to be Roman when Rome itself was gone? Was the empire still Rome, or merely a memory draped in purple robes? The citizens of Constantinople lived within that question, their daily lives a quiet defiance of history's verdict. Ships still sailed in from the Black Sea, carrying furs from the north and honey from the steppes. Artisans still worked ivory and gold into icons whose serene faces seemed untouched by human turmoil. Children still chased one another through the colonnades of the Augustaion, their laughter rising like birdsong above the murmur of worried elders. Life persisted, not because the future was secure, but because life has a way of enduring even when the world frays at its edges. As seasons turned, the city's rhythms continued. Spring brought markets bright with flowers and the arrival of merchant fleets. Summer filled the hippodrome with the roar of chariot races. Autumn sent priests in solemn processions through streets scented with smoke and myrrh. And winter, cold and damp, pressed people closer together, huddled around braziers, while the sea winds howled through narrow alleys. Through it all, the empire clung to its identity, even as the map around it was redrawn by rival hands. The greatest danger was not a single siege or sudden invasion. It was the slow, grinding pressure of many threats at once, the kind of pressure that wears down stone and spirit alike. And yet, beneath the weight of those gathering shadows, something remarkable endured. The people of Constantinople adapted. They tightened their defences, sharpened their diplomacy, learned when to fight and when to bargain. They turned setbacks into breathing space, defeats into lessons. From the vantage of centuries, it is easy to see the pattern forming. Each loss forced the empire to become more resilient, more cunning, more aware of its own fragility. The Byzantines learned to live with uncertainty, to survive not through brute strength, but through flexibility and endurance. The city that once ruled continents began to master the art of survival on a knife's edge, an art that would one day allow it to rise again when the moment came. On quiet nights, when the moon spilled silver across the waters of the Bosphorus, a visitor might stand atop the sea walls and look outward to the dark horizon. Out there lay enemies, storms, and the long memory of Rome's fall. But inside the walls, the lamp still burned, the prayers still rose, and the heartbeat of the empire continued, steady, patient, waiting. The shadows were deepening, yes, but within those shadows the faint glow of resilience had not been extinguished. Constantinople remained. A solitary light in a darkening world, it stood not as a relic of past glory, but as a living testament to survival. The empire had lost much, and more losses were to come, but the spirit of endurance was already hardening, like iron hidden in the heart of the stone, and in that quiet, unyielding spirit lay the seed of a comeback the world had yet to imagine. The stones of Constantinople remember. They carry in their cracks and foundations the weight of ambition, the echo of voices that once dared to reshape the world. Few voices were louder, few ambitions greater, than those of Emperor Justinian. He dreamed not merely of ruling Byzantium, but of restoring the Roman world itself, of gathering the broken shards of empire and fusing them back into one unshakable whole. For a time, it seemed possible. For a fleeting moment, the dream burned bright. But dreams, when pressed against the grinding wheel of reality, often leave only ash. Walk through the avenues of the city in those days, and you would feel the presence of Justinian everywhere. His monuments rose in marble and gold. The Hagia Sophia, with its vast dome, floating like heaven itself, was not just a church, but a statement. That Rome still lived, that God had chosen this city, that no ruin was beyond repair. The colonnades stretched proudly, aqueducts carried life across the city, and fountains bubbled with the sound of triumph. To many, it must have felt as though the world was being remade. His armies marched westward under the banners of the double-headed eagle, reclaiming lands that had slipped from Roman grasp. North Africa fell back into imperial hands. Italy, long fractured and scarred, was drawn again beneath the imperial standard. Spain too felt the touch of Justinian's ambition. For a brief and dazzling span of years, maps began to look Roman once more. The old heart of empire stirred, as if awakened from a long and bitter sleep. But every dream has its cost, and Justinian's vision came with a weight his empire could scarcely bear. The treasury groaned under the strain of endless campaigns. Soldiers bled not only on foreign soil, but in the fields that fed them, as war and neglect drained the lifeblood of provinces. Constantinople, glittering on the surface, carried beneath its mosaics and domes a tension, a sense that the grandeur was too fragile, too heavily bought. Then came the fire within the city itself. The Nika riots began with the fury of factions in the Hippodrome, but they exploded into something far greater, an uprising that threatened to tear the empire apart from within. Flames consumed districts, smoke choked the sky, and for days Constantinople trembled on the brink of collapse. When the fires were quenched and the rioters slaughtered, the city was quieter but darker. The rebuilding that followed gave rise to new monuments, yet the scars remained, hidden beneath fresh stone. And if fire scarred the city, pestilence scarred the soul. The plague of Justinian swept through Constantinople like a shadow, with no end. Corpses filled the streets, piled high in pits outside the walls. Families were hollowed in a matter of days, entire neighbourhoods silenced. Ships carried death along the trade routes, spreading it to the provinces, draining the empire not only of soldiers and workers, but of hope itself. No wall, no emperor, no dream could keep the sickness at bay. The same wind that carried incense through the halls of Hagia Sophia also carried the stench of decay. What Justinian had built with such fierce determination began to unravel even before his death. Italy, won at terrible cost, descended into chaos again. North Africa trembled under renewed threats. The frontiers to the east strained against Persian pressure. The empire had stretched itself thin, and the thin fabric tore under the pull of too many burdens. What had seemed like restoration revealed itself as overreach, a flame that had burned too hot and too fast, leaving behind only embers. For the citizens of Constantinople, the years after Justinian felt different. The monuments still stood, magnificent and defiant, but there was a hollowness beneath the splendour. They walked past the Hagia Sophia in awe, yet in the same breath they passed beggars whose faces bore the pallor of hunger. They cheered at the Hippodrome, but the cheers carried an edge of desperation, as if by shouting loud enough they could drown out the silence of lost provinces. The city lived, but the dream of a reunited empire was already ash carried on the sea winds. It is in this contrast between soaring ambition and the harshness of decline that Byzantium's story takes its shape. For the greatest comebacks are not born in steady times, they emerge from ruin. The dream of Justinian had stretched Byzantium to its limits, and in its collapse, the empire was left brittle and exposed. Yet even this collapse did not mean the end. The ashes that fell from Justinian's vision would, in time, harden into something new, something less dazzling perhaps, but more enduring. In the decades that followed, Constantinople stood as a city haunted by memory. Travellers from the provinces spoke of empty farms where fields had once been golden, of towns reduced to rubble, of roads once busy with soldiers, now echoing with silence. Within the city walls, scholars debated theology with intensity that sometimes bordered on violence, as if clinging to divine truth could compensate for earthly loss. Councils were called, heresies named, exiles ordered. The empire wrestled not only with enemies at its borders, but with divisions in its soul. The grandeur of Justinian's dream became a ghost that lingered in every corridor of the palace, in every shadow of the Hagia Sophia's dome. Emperors who followed could not escape it. They ruled in its long shadow, measured against an impossible standard. Some tried to revive the dream with smaller wars. Others turned inward to secure what little remained. None could erase the memory of what had been gained, and then lost. For the people, the empire began to feel like a survivor more than a conqueror. The focus shifted from expanding borders to preserving what was left, from dreams of dominion to the art of endurance. The language of triumph gave way to the language of resilience. And yet, in the quiet persistence of daily life, in the slow rebuilding of farms, the repairing of ships, the constant ringing of church bells, there was strength. Out of ashes, something steadier than Justinian's dream was beginning to take root. Stand again on the walls of Constantinople in those years and look outward. To the west, lands once Roman slipped from sight. To the east, enemies massed with relentless energy. The sea was wide, the night long, and the empire seemed diminished. Yet beneath your feet, the stones of the walls remained solid. The lamps of the city still burned, and the murmur of voices in the streets rose like a chorus of defiance. The dream of Justinian had ended, but Byzantium had not. Its people carried forward, scarred and weary, but unbroken. They had seen glory, and they had seen ruin. Now they would learn to live in the space between the two, waiting for the moment when history would turn again in their favour. For it was often in the ashes, not in the flames, that Byzantium found its strange and stubborn strength. The empire's story was no longer one of distant conquests, but of looming footsteps drawing ever closer. Beyond the walls of Constantinople, the world was shifting, and the sound of armies echoed across valleys and plains like an approaching storm. From every horizon, enemies moved with relentless purpose, and the Byzantines found themselves not at the edge of triumph, but in the centre of a siege that never seemed to end. It began quietly, in the slow pressure of migrations and raids. To the north, waves of Slavic tribes pushed into the Balkans, their settlements sprouting in lands that had once been Roman fields. Villages burned, fortresses fell, and rivers that had long been guarded crossing points became highways of invasion. The countryside emptied as farmers abandoned their lands, slipping away into forests, or fleeing toward the safety of Constantinople's walls. Roads that had once carried grain carts and soldiers now carried only silence and smoke. To the east, the Persian Empire had not forgotten its rivalry with Byzantium. Armies pressed against the frontier, their banners rising over fortified passes and river crossings. Battles were fought in dusty valleys where the cries of men mingled with the clash of iron. Cities along the frontier changed hands again and again, their walls scarred by sieges, their streets echoing with the march of alternating conquerors. For the soldiers stationed there, loyalty to empire was measured in the constant defence of ground that could never be held for long. And then, from the deserts, a new power appeared, swift, hungry, unstoppable. The armies of Islam surged outward with astonishing speed, carrying with them both faith and fire. They swept through Syria, Palestine and Egypt, lands that had been Byzantine heartlands for centuries. Alexandria's libraries, Antioch's markets, Jerusalem's holy stones, all passed into new hands. The loss was not only strategic, but spiritual. To lose these lands was to lose the cradle of the empire's soul, the places where Christianity had flourished, where Roman legions had once stood unchallenged. Inside Constantinople, news of these losses arrived like waves striking the shore, one after another, ceaseless, each more devastating than the last. The court scribes recorded the defeats, the priests offered prayers, and the people listened in silence, their city becoming less the heart of a vast empire and more a lone fortress against an encircling world. The The market still bustled, the bells of Hagia Sophia still rang, but a shadow of unease lay across every street. The empire had once been the centre of the known world, but now it felt surrounded. To the north, the forests teemed with Slavic settlers and Avar horsemen. To the west, Lombards carved pieces from Italy. To the east, the Persians lingered, and behind them, the new Arab armies pressed ever forward. It was as if history itself had turned against Byzantium, driving enemies from every direction toward its shrinking borders. Constantinople, however, was not like other cities. It had been built for survival, its defences towering like a man-made mountain. The triple walls of Theodosius stretched across the landward side, each layer higher than the one before, a barrier that could break the strength of any invader. Siege engines shattered against it, scaling ladders toppled into ditches, and armies left behind their dead in fields that became graveyards of ambition. The city endured because it was more than walls, it was will. Every siege strengthened that will, teaching the Byzantines that they could hold out even when the world beyond was slipping from their grasp. But enemies did not come only with swords and catapults. Hunger marched with them. Each invasion cut off trade routes, starved the city of grain, and sent prices soaring in the markets. Families lined up for bread that grew thinner with each passing year. Famine stalked the city as surely as any army, creeping into homes, leaving its mark in hollow faces and weary eyes. For many, survival meant learning to endure scarcity as much as enemy blades. Even so, the city adapted. Cisterns beneath the streets stored water for months of siege. Warehouses filled with grain, salted fish, and oil were guarded as carefully as palaces. Engineers reinforced crumbling sections of wall, patching stone with stone until the defences seemed to breathe with the people themselves. And in the harbours, fleets waited, ready to carry the empire's most secret weapon, Greek fire, against any who dared to challenge the seas. The march of enemies brought not only suffering, but transformation. The empire that had once stretched proudly across continents now learned the art of survival in confinement. It shed its outer lands like a creature shrinking into its shell. Each enemy that closed in forced Byzantium to become harder, more cunning, more enduring. Survival was no longer about glory, it was about time. Time to wait for enemies to falter, time to endure when others could not. The people of Constantinople lived in this strange rhythm of threat and survival. By day, they went about their lives, bargaining in the markets, praying in the churches, watching races in the hippodrome. By night, they listened for the sound of distant drums, the flicker of torches on the horizon, the approach of yet another enemy. Life was lived on a knife's edge, yet it persisted, stubborn and unyielding. What must it have felt like to stand on the sea walls at dusk, looking out toward the endless horizon, knowing that beyond those waters marched countless enemies? To the west, horsemen and chieftains carved their kingdoms. To the east, caliphs and shahs sent forth armies of faith and empire. And yet within the walls, lamps flickered, children played, and the sound of chanting rose with the evening wind. It was a city suspended between despair and defiance. History remembers empires for their victories, but Byzantium's greatness lay equally in its defeats. For every province lost, every city abandoned, the empire found a way to endure. Its enemies marched, but they could not finish what they began. They could wound, weaken and threaten, but they could not erase. The empire's survival became its quiet rebellion against history's tide. And so, as the enemies pressed closer, Byzantium bent but did not break. Its lands grew smaller, its resources thinner, its people more weary. But the city still stood, watching from its high walls as armies marched by, as if daring the world to try and bring it down. The march of enemies was relentless, but so too was the endurance of the city they surrounded. Between the two forces, endless attack and endless survival, history found its balance. And in that balance, in the long night of pressure and siege, Byzantium's chance for resurgence was slowly, invisibly taking shape. For the enemies could march forever, but Constantinople could endure longer. Stone does not speak, yet it remembers. Every scar, every mark left upon its surface tells a story. And in Constantinople, no storyteller was older or more steadfast than the Theodosian walls. They stretched across the landward side of the city like the spine of an ancient beast, tier upon tier of stone and brick, deep ditches before them, towers rising at intervals like silent sentinels. For centuries they had stood, and in their silence they bore witness to the endless march of enemies, to the cries of citizens, to the heavy toll of both triumph and despair. The walls were not simply defences, they were companions to the life of the city. Within their protection, children were born, markets thrived, churches rose, and emperors plotted futures that seemed always uncertain. Outside, the world thundered with the footsteps of armies. It was here that the empire's story was most clearly written, not in the gold mosaics of Hagia Sophia or the ceremonies of the Hippodrome, but in the stone that kept the city alive when all else seemed lost. The people who lived beneath their shadow knew the walls as more than stone. They were guardians, protectors whose presence was woven into every day of life. When a farmer brought his goods to market, he passed beneath their gates. When soldiers marched, they touched the weathered stone, as if drawing strength from it. When bells rang in warning, the walls were the first to answer, bracing against yet another wave of invaders. And they had much to remember. Persian armies had hurled their might against them, their engines pounding until the ground shook, only to break and retreat. The Avars had filled the horizon with horsemen and siege towers, but the walls had stared back, unyielding, until the enemy grew weary and withdrew. Slavic raiders had burned the countryside, hoping to starve the city into submission, but the walls held their people safe within, silent witnesses to hunger, suffering, and survival. Later came the Arabs, their banners bright against the sky, their fleets filling the waters. For years they returned, each time believing that Constantinople would finally yield, and each time the walls stood firm, indifferent to promises of glory or threats of destruction. They had been built to withstand more than men. They had been built to withstand time. The soldiers who manned them changed. Emperors came and went, but the walls endured. The hands that repaired their cracks belonged to countless generations, each leaving behind a piece of themselves in the mortar. To lean against them was to touch the labour of centuries. In their silence, the walls carried the memory of everyone who had ever trusted their strength. But the walls did not only see enemies, they saw the city within. They watched processions of emperors crowned in splendour, the glittering robes of the court shimmering like sunlight on water. They watched the Hippodrome erupt in cheers as horses raced beneath the banners of rival factions. They saw children chasing each other in narrow alleys, fishermen hauling nets from the Golden Horn, monks crossing courtyards with quiet prayers. The walls were not only protectors in war, they were the backdrop of life itself. They knew, too, the burden of fear. When news arrived that an enemy army was approaching, families would climb the walls, staring out into the horizon, waiting for the dust cloud that meant horsemen were near. Merchants closed their stalls, priests filled the churches, and the city prepared itself for yet another trial. Each time, The walls bore the weight of those fearful eyes, carrying in silence the hopes of a people who had nowhere else to turn. And yet, for all their strength, the walls could not shield the empire's heart from sorrow. They saw famine spread, hunger gnawing at the city when supply lines were cut. They saw pestilence creep in during long sieges, sickness slipping through cracks where no enemy could pass. They heard the cries of the desperate and the whispers of betrayal when some within the city doubted survival. Silent though they were, the walls were never untouched by the suffering they enclosed. At night, when the torches burned low and the city grew quiet, the walls kept their vigil. The sea lapped against their foundations on the Marmara side, gulls circled above, and the stars shone on their weathered stone. Outside, enemy camps flickered with firelight, their drums echoing into the distance. But the walls did not move, did not tremble. They stood, as they always had, waiting for morning, waiting for the next attempt to bring them down. What enemy armies did not understand was that the walls were more than defence. They were a symbol. To bring them down was to break not only the city, but the spirit of its people. Each time they stood, the city endured. Each time the enemy retreated, the legend of the walls grew stronger, woven into songs, sermons, and whispered prayers. They became more than stone and mortar. They became faith itself, the proof that survival was possible even when the world pressed in from every side. Generations passed beneath their shadow, and still they watched. When a child asked his mother if the city would ever fall, she pointed to the walls and said no. When an old man told stories of battles past, he pointed to the cracks in the stone as proof of what had been endured. The walls became the measure of time, standing constant while lives flickered and faded. And yet, though they could not speak, the walls bore secrets. They knew of the nights when defenders whispered of despair, when an emperor stood on the battlements and questioned whether the city could endure another siege. They knew of the hidden tunnels beneath them, where soldiers slipped out to harass an enemy camp, or merchants smuggled food into a starving city. They knew of the betrayals attempted, the bribes offered at their gates, the desperate bargains made in the face of overwhelming threat. Silent though they were, the walls had seen all, and in their silence they remembered. As the years grew darker and the empire shrank further, the walls remained unchanged. Provinces fell, borders shifted, rulers rose and vanished, but the city still stood. Each time the sun rose over the Marmara, its first light touched those stones, as if confirming that Constantinople had survived another night. And in that endurance lay the seed of its eventual resurgence. The walls did not boast, did not proclaim victory. They only stood, and in their stillness they carried a truth the enemies never understood, that survival itself can be the greatest act of defiance. The walls had been built to guard against siege, but in time they became the soul of a city that refused to fall. Long after the shouts of enemies faded, long after the dust of their camps blew away, the walls remained. Their stones bore the memory of fire and iron, hunger and hope, defeat and endurance. They watched without judgment, silent companions to a city that seemed always on the edge of ruin, yet always beyond destruction. And so they waited, as they always had, watching in silence for what the world would bring next. Hunger has a sound. It is not only the growl of an empty stomach, but the creak of wooden shutters closing over stalls where no bread is sold, the hush of markets where once the air rang with bargaining voices. It is the silence of a city that measures its days not by the rising sun, but by how long the grain will last. Constantinople, mighty as it appeared with its towering walls and domes of gleaming stone, knew this sound well. The empire's enemies had learned that the walls could not be broken by force, but they had also learned something far more effective. Stone cannot feed a city. Armies camped outside the walls, not always to storm them, but to choke them. They cut the roads that led from the fertile plains. They sent fleets to block the harbours. They let the city's own abundance turn against it, trapping its people in a prison of stone. Inside, the first days of a blockade were marked with resilience. The bakeries still smoked with their ovens, though flour was rationed. Fishermen cast their nets into the Golden Horn, bringing back what little the waters would yield. Families ate sparingly, convincing themselves the siege would not last. They remembered how, in the past, enemies had grown impatient and withdrawn. Surely this would be the same. But days turned into weeks. The stalls that once overflowed with olives, figs and cheese grew bare. Fishermen returned with empty nets. The great granaries, meant to sustain the city in hard times, emptied grain by grain until their silence was as heavy as the silence of the markets. Mothers thinned soup with water until it resembled nothing more than cloudy broth. Children chewed on hardened crusts long past their age of freshness. The city had been built to impress, to overwhelm visitors with its splendour. Golden mosaics glittered inside Hagia Sophia. The emperor's palace shimmered with marble and silk. Yet now, as the city starved, those riches were meaningless. A jewel-studded chalice could not be eaten. A palace paved in porphyry could not fill a child's belly. Hunger stripped away the illusions of grandeur and revealed the fragility beneath. As the weeks dragged on, the signs of hunger spread across the city streets. Eyes grew hollow, cheeks sunken. The hum of life gave way to a slow, weary shuffle. Merchants, once loud and bold in their trade, sat listless in empty shops. Priests preached endurance, urging faith in God's protection, but their own voices trembled with weakness. In the hippodrome, where once the factions roared in rivalry, silence settled like dust. The people turned inward, searching desperately for sustenance. Some stripped bark from trees, boiling it into bitter slurries. Others ground weeds into coarse flour, baking loaves that crumbled to dust in their mouths. Cats and dogs, once companions, became scarce in the streets. Even rats, usually despised, became prizes when caught. Hunger reduced the empire's proud citizens to foragers in their own city, their every thought consumed by the question of how to survive one more day. The air itself seemed to carry the weight of hunger. The smoke from cooking fires no longer held the fragrance of roasted meats or spiced stews, but the acrid scent of boiling grasses. The bells that called the faithful to prayer rang over an audience too weak to attend. Processions that once filled the avenues with colour and chant dwindled into scattered gatherings of the desperate, muttering prayers with hollow eyes. And yet, the city did not collapse. Hunger gnawed at its spirit, but the walls still held, and within those walls the people endured. Desperation forced them to create new rituals, small gestures of survival. Families gathered to share even the smallest scraps, the act of dividing food becoming sacred in itself. Neighbours who once quarrelled now whispered together, pooling resources, hiding caches of dried beans or salted fish to stretch the weeks. Hunger forged a quiet, bitter unity, binding the people in their shared suffering. The emperor himself was not spared from the shadow of hunger. His palace, though stocked longer than the markets, eventually felt the same emptiness. Courtiers, once lavishly adorned, grew thin beneath their silks. Banquets dwindled to sparse meals. The grandeur of the throne seemed brittle when its occupant shared the same weakness as the common man. Rulers could issue decrees, generals could command armies, but hunger answered to none. In the darker corners of the city, whispers grew. Despair is a fertile ground for betrayal, and hunger gave it voice. Some wondered if the walls were worth defending, if life within them meant starvation. Others whispered of surrender, of opening the gates in exchange for bread, but the walls stood silent, and those whispers never became more than murmurs. The people had seen too much to believe in mercy from those camped outside. Better hunger, they told themselves, than chains. And so the city endured, its strength tested not by the clash of swords, but by the slow erosion of the body. Hunger became the true siege engine, grinding away at resolve with each passing day. The walls could deflect arrows, withstand stones hurled by catapults, but they could not keep out the emptiness growing inside every stomach. When relief finally came, whether through the retreat of the enemy, the breaking of a blockade, or the arrival of supplies, the city did not erupt in triumph. There were no parades, no thunderous celebrations. The people were too weak, too worn. Bread was baked again, but it was eaten in silence, in gratitude that bordered on disbelief. The return of food was not a victory feast, but a quiet resurrection, a reminder that survival was still possible. And yet, hunger left scars deeper than those cut by swords. Families remembered the taste of desperation long after their tables filled again. Children carried the memory of gnawing emptiness into adulthood. Even in times of plenty, the city never forgot how fragile abundance could be. Hunger had become part of its memory, another shadow cast upon its story. The walls had protected Constantinople, yes, but hunger had shown the people that stone alone could not preserve them. To endure, they needed more than fortifications. They needed resilience, faith, and the bitter knowledge that survival sometimes meant nothing more than enduring another day, no matter how empty the stomach. Constantinople, the city that dazzled with wealth and endurance, had looked into the abyss of starvation and refused to vanish. And though hunger was a quieter enemy than the armies beyond the gates, it was no less deadly. It was a reminder that the empire's greatest battles were not always fought with swords, but with the human will to endure what seemed unendurable. The city, scarred but alive, continued its vigil. The markets would one day fill again, the ovens would burn with new loaves, the hippodrome would roar once more. But beneath it all, lingering in the silence between celebrations, would remain the memory of hunger, the ghost that had once walked every street, a reminder of how close the empire had come to breaking, and how remarkable it was that it had not. Darkness does not always come with the fall of night. It can linger at noon, settle over streets filled with people, and hang heavy in the silence of a once proud city. In Constantinople, darkness took the form of weariness. It was in the way men's shoulders sagged under the burden of endless sieges, in the hollow eyes of mothers who had no more food to divide, in the silence of priests whose prayers sounded like echoes in a cavern rather than cries of faith. The city endured, but endurance is not the same as living, and yet it takes very little to disturb darkness. A spark, almost too small to notice, can break it. Sparks do not roar like fires, nor do they blind like lightning. They flicker, uncertain, fragile. But if they last long enough, if they spread from one person to another, they change the night into something less suffocating. For Byzantium, such sparks appeared at moments when it seemed the city's story would at last end in silence. Sometimes the spark came from faith. When hunger pressed hardest and defeat seemed certain, stories spread of visions seen on the ramparts. Soldiers swore they glimpsed a woman robed in blue walking the battlements, her presence quiet and steady, her gaze turned toward the camps beyond the walls. They whispered that it was the Virgin herself, guarding her city. Whether vision or rumour, the tale spread from mouth to mouth, until the weary lifted their heads, convinced that they were not alone. Faith was thin as a thread, but even threads can bind the broken together. At other times, the spark came from ingenuity. Fire was the enemy of all walls, yet in Constantinople, fire became a weapon. A secret mixture, sticky and unquenchable, hurled from tubes mounted on ships. Greek fire, as it came to be called. It burned even upon the sea, curling over waves, clinging to wood, to sail, to flesh. Enemies who believed themselves safe upon their fleets suddenly found the waters alive with flame. The city had created its own thunder, a terror that could scatter armies without striking stone. Where hunger had weakened them, invention offered something new. Not just survival, but defiance. There were sparks too, in the smallest acts. A soldier offering half his ration to the child clinging to his leg. A woman tending a sick neighbour, though her own body trembled with fever. A fisherman risking arrows to slip through a blockade and bring back enough food to feed a family. None of these gestures could save a city on their own, but together they wove resilience. Darkness feeds on despair, but every act of compassion lit a candle against it. The emperors themselves, flawed as they often were, sometimes became sparks. One would stride among the battlements, his cloak tattered, his eyes hollow from the same hunger that afflicted his people. But his presence told them their suffering was shared. Another would rally what soldiers remained, leading charges from the gates, not because victory was certain, but because hopelessness was worse than death. The city had seen emperors who fled, emperors who schemed, emperors who wasted its strength. But it had also seen those who stood as long as the walls did, men who refused to abandon the city even when it seemed already lost. There is a rhythm to despair, the slow fading of hope, the quiet acceptance that nothing will change. But sparks break rhythm. They intrude, forcing the weary to look again, to believe again, even if only for another day. Constantinople's story is filled with such interruptions. Each time the city bent beneath hunger, fire, and siege, something flickered. A miracle, a weapon, a word, an act that shifted the weight enough to let survival continue. And once a spark catches, it spreads. Songs were whispered in the taverns, simple hymns that carried more comfort than food. Mothers told children stories of past victories, their voices steady even when their stomachs growled. Priests raised icons high above processions, the painted faces gleaming with candlelight, reminders that the divine had not forgotten the city. Each gesture was small, but together they became a blaze bright enough to carry the city through nights when hope seemed absent. The enemies outside could not see these sparks. They saw only hunger within the walls, weakness in the soldiers, silence in the markets. They did not understand that a starving city is not always a broken one. The people behind the walls had learned how to draw strength from the faintest of lights, how to take despair itself and hammer it into something unyielding. The spark in the darkness was not triumph, it was persistence. It did not erase suffering, but it refused to let suffering be the final word. It was the belief, fragile but unbroken, that tomorrow could still arrive, that the gates would not fall, that the walls would not be breached. It was not glory nor grandeur, but something quieter and more enduring. And in that quiet resilience lay the seed of Byzantium's survival. An empire reduced, a city pressed to the edge of ruin, a people living with hunger and fear, all should have been enough to end it. Yet time and again, something flared, not a roaring fire, not a triumphant blaze, but a spark. Enough to push back the darkness for one more night, one more siege, one more century. The greatest comeback in history was not born in sudden victories or grand conquests. It was born in moments like these, when a city on the brink found, within itself, a flicker of light. That spark, fragile yet persistent, was the ember that would one day ignite into renewal. And though the night still stretched long and heavy, Constantinople carried its flame, hidden but alive, waiting for the moment when darkness would finally break. The walls still stood. The spark had not gone out. But men cannot live on sparks alone. Armies are not fed by dreams or bound by prayers. They march on stomachs filled, pockets weighed with coins, promises backed by gold that glitters in the light of morning. And in Byzantium, there came long stretches of time when such promises dissolved into air, when the empire's defenders found themselves clinging not to wealth, nor reward, nor even expectation, but to the barest instinct of survival. Soldiers who had once marched with polished spears and bright banners found themselves in patched tunics, their armour dented, their sandals worn thin, their swords dulled with years of use. Their shields bore scars not only from enemies, but from neglect. The empire was shrinking, its treasury hollowed by endless wars, its revenues stolen by provinces already lost. Those who stood guard upon the walls of Constantinople often did so without pay, their duty transformed from profession to burden. And yet they stayed. The reason was not loyalty alone. Many had no land to return to, no farm waiting beyond the horizon, no trade to take up once the sword was laid aside. War had consumed their lives, and Constantinople, bleak, hungry, battered, remained the only place that offered meaning. Some believed still in the emperor, in the cross, in the city itself, as the chosen heart of Christendom. Others believed only in the man beside them on the wall, the comrade who would bleed as they bled. But belief did not ease their suffering. Unpaid, soldiers pawned what little they owned. Some sold armour piece by piece, trading away the steel that once kept them alive. Others turned to theft, slipping through alleys in the night, their hands quick, their eyes haunted. Discipline frayed, desertions multiplied. In times when the enemy pressed close, men slipped away, not from cowardice alone, but from the despair of fighting for nothing. Generals, once the pride of Rome's tradition, found themselves leading ghosts of armies. They were commanders without coin to offer, strategists without provisions to feed their troops. Their titles carried weight, but their authority was brittle. How does one command when men's stomachs groan louder than the trumpets? How does one inspire when the treasury is a hollow echo, and the emperor's promises ring false? Some generals clung to discipline with iron fists, punishing deserters, lashing thieves, demanding obedience where no reward could justify it. Others turned cynical, filling their own purses in the shadows, enriching themselves while their soldiers starved. And a rare few, those remembered with something like reverence, shared the same rations, slept beneath the same leaking roofs, and fought alongside their men, not as commanders above them, but as equals. Still, hope was scarce. The empire no longer stretched across the Mediterranean as it once had. Its legions were gone, its fleets reduced, its tax base eroded. Battles were fought with mercenaries, hired with promises of payment that often dissolved before the ink dried. These men came not for loyalty to Byzantium, but for silver. And when silver vanished, so too did their allegiance. The empire's armies became shifting sands, never steady, never secure. And yet, despite this hollowing, Constantinople endured. Battles were lost, provinces surrendered, fields burned, but the city itself remained. Men fought not for glory, not for wealth, but for the strange truth that if the city fell, all fell with it. To abandon the walls was to abandon the last fragment of a world that had once ruled from Britain to the Euphrates. Even generals without hope, found themselves dragged back into the fight, for there was no place else to go. In the barracks, men spoke of better days, of ancestors who had marched with Constantine, with Justinian, with Heraclius. Their own lives bore little resemblance to those legends, but memory has power. Even as their bellies ached, even as their pay never came, they dreamed of being part of something larger than themselves, a city that had outlasted enemies who should have crushed it. They grumbled, cursed, deserted, rebelled. Yet when the horns of alarm rang and the enemy appeared before the gates, many still climbed the walls, shouldering shields worn thin, gripping spears splintered with age. The tragedy of Byzantium in these years was not the absence of courage, but the absence of means. Men willing to fight found themselves betrayed by the poverty of the empire, by its shrinking heart. Generals trained in strategy traced lines on maps, but knew they had too few men to hold them, too little food to supply them. The brilliance of command was wasted when there were no soldiers to carry it out. And yet, out of this hollowed shell, endurance was forged. Armies unpaid still fought, not always with precision or with grandeur, but with the stubbornness of those who had nothing else left. Generals without hope still directed defences, still held walls, still launched raids into the night because surrender would mean oblivion. The enemy outside the walls might see weakness in the tattered cloaks, in the hollow cheeks of soldiers, in the silent despair of commanders. But they often misjudged. A man with nothing left to lose is not easily broken. Hunger does not always weaken. It sometimes hardens, stripping away all illusions until only the bare will to survive remains. And that will is difficult to extinguish. So the soldiers without pay still stood guard. The generals without hope still raised their standards. The city still lived, its heartbeat faint but unbroken. Byzantium's story was not one of triumph piled upon triumph, but of survival stacked against impossibility. Men who should have abandoned their posts remained. Commanders who should have laid down their swords still drew them. And though despair lingered, though hunger gnawed, though treasuries lay empty and promises rotted on the tongue, the city did not fall. Its armies, ragged and underfed, still answered the call. Its generals, weary and hollow-eyed, still plotted under flickering lamplight. What remained of Rome's empire should have dissolved into silence, scattered like dust upon the wind. But it did not, for even soldiers without pay can fight when their city is all that remains. Even generals without hope can command when surrender is unthinkable. And in their persistence, battered, flawed, reluctant though it was, Byzantium endured long enough to find the ember that would kindle its greatest comeback. The walls of Constantinople had grown used to silence, to years of endurance rather than triumph. Hunger had gnawed at the city, soldiers had fought without coin, and generals had planned in shadows, not with confidence, but with a kind of stubborn despair. Yet the strange thing about history is that even the longest night is never endless. Somewhere beyond the smoke, beyond the grey waters of the Bosporus, beyond the crumbling provinces, a shift began, small at first, a breath carried on the wind rather than a storm. It was not obvious in the beginning. Change rarely announces itself with thunder. Instead, it trickles, almost unnoticed, until the city that has endured for survival alone suddenly finds itself walking toward revival. The empire that had once seemed a ghost began to stir. It was not wealth returning overnight, nor armies swelling to their former ranks. The change came in the smallest fragments. An ally kept a promise, a trade route reopened, a single victory won on ground thought already lost. The tide does not roar back in a single wave. It creeps along the shore, inch by inch, until the sand is no longer dry. One turning came from the sea. For years the empire's navy had withered, ships rotting in harbours, their crews dismissed or scattered. Without command of the waters, Constantinople's very lifeblood, its trade, its grain, its connection to the wider world, was severed. Yet slowly, painfully, a fleet began to return. Not the grand armadas of the Empire's golden age, bristling with soldiers and war engines, but leaner, smaller ships, manned by sailors hardened by hunger and war. With fire-tipped weapons and a knowledge of the currents, they began to harass enemies who had grown complacent. And once again, the city felt the hum of oars upon the water, the whisper of sails rising against the wind. There were victories too, small but startling. In border skirmishes, mercenaries and unpaid soldiers struck back, their resolve sharpened by years of loss. When an enemy force expected retreat, it found instead an ambush. When towns thought abandoned, they saw the banners of the empire return, ragged but still raised. These were not grand conquests, they were sparks in the night. But sparks, when gathered, can ignite a flame. In the palace, emperors who had once been little more than figureheads began to act with clarity, some with desperation, others with vision. Coin, scarce as it was scraped together to fund the rebuilding of walls, to commission ships, to reward loyalty however meagerly. Diplomats ventured outward, weaving alliances not with arrogance, but with necessity. Byzantium, once too proud to bow, now bargained, pleaded, offered marriages, land, or titles in exchange for survival. And survival brought breathing room. Breathing room gave way to opportunity. The city itself began to change in spirit. Where once the streets echoed with despair, murmurs of endurance turned into whispers of possibility. The markets, though still thin, showed signs of movement. Grain brought in from across the sea, spices trickling through despite blockades, merchants daring to trade once more beneath the city's high walls. The clatter of blacksmiths returned, repairing armour and forging weapons for men who believed again in the worth of their struggle. Generals who had spent years with hollow eyes now found themselves daring to plan not only for defence, but for attack. They traced routes not simply of retreat, but of advance. Soldiers, though still unpaid, felt a shift within themselves. Hunger remained, poverty remained, but to fight for survival alone is different than to fight with the sense that survival may one day lead to victory. Men who once deserted now returned. Mercenaries stayed longer than their contracts required. Something unseen but undeniable was spreading. The empire had known humiliation, collapse, despair. Yet humiliation can harden, collapse can teach. Despair can make men immune to fear. Byzantium had been stripped down to its bones, but bones once set can hold strong. And so the tide began to turn, not in a single moment, but through the relentless accumulation of smaller ones, each victory building upon the last, each regained breath allowing the next. From the western lands, word arrived of enemies quarrelling among themselves, their attention divided. To the east, others faced threats of their own, loosening their grip upon the empire's borders. Byzantium, long the hunted, began to slip through the cracks of its enemies' ambitions. Where it should have broken, it bent. Where it should have shattered, it endured. And now, endurance turned into In the streets of Constantinople, prayers rose with greater fervour. Candles flickered longer in the churches. Chants echoed with voices that no longer trembled only with despair, but with a trembling kind of hope. The great dome of Hagia Sophia still stood, its mosaics glowing faintly in the dim light, reminding all who entered that they were part of something vast, something chosen, something not yet finished. The tide was not a flood. There were still defeats, still hunger, still nights when despair gripped the city. But for the first time in what felt like lifetimes, there was balance. The empire was no longer always falling back. Sometimes it was pressing forward. Soldiers once called unpaid were now whispered of as the loyal, men who had fought through the worst and remained. Generals who had commanded without hope now planned campaigns that seemed possible. And as the tide shifted, so too did the imagination of the city. Constantinople was no longer just the last fortress of a dying world. It became again the heart of something larger. The dream that Rome's light had not been extinguished, but merely dimmed. What had been endurance alone began to feel like destiny. And destiny is a powerful weapon, sharper than iron, stronger than stone. The tide does not roar in at once. It licks the edges of the shore, pulls back, returns, each time. A little higher, a little stronger. Byzantium's comeback was like that. Not sudden, not overwhelming, but steady, patient, unstoppable once begun. For years the city had lived on the edge of hunger, with soldiers unpaid, generals hopeless. Now the same walls that had borne witness to despair began to echo with something else. Quiet, fragile but unmistakable, the turning of the tide. Exile is a crucible. It strips away the weight of crowns, the pretense of ceremony, the illusion of control. It leaves a man with only his failures, his scars, and the stubborn thread of his will. Many emperors of Byzantium learned this truth not in the marble halls of Constantinople, but in lands far from the Golden Gate, where their names carried little more than the echo of what had been lost. Yet it was in those places, among foreign courts, barren countrysides, or fortified towns trembling on the edge of collapse, that a different kind of ruler was shaped. The empire's comeback would not have been possible without them, men hardened not by the velvet of a throne, but by the chill of exile. When Constantinople fell to Latin crusaders in 1204, the empire seemed to splinter into dust. The city that had been the jewel of Christendom was torn apart, its relics carted off to the west, its streets filled with the laughter of conquerors. The great throne of Byzantium was gone. But the Byzantine world did not vanish. Like molten metal poured into many moulds, fragments of the empire took shape across the broken lands. In Nicaea, in Epirus, in Trebizond, rulers clung to scraps of legitimacy, calling themselves emperors not of what they held, but of what they dreamed to regain. The most enduring of these fragments lay in Nicaea, a city west of Asia Minor, safe behind its lakes and walls. It was here that one of the strangest experiments in survival began. Far from Constantinople's grandeur, emperors in exile learned to rule without excess. They gathered what refugees they could, rebuilding schools, churches, and armies in miniature. What could have been a graveyard of ambitions instead became a seedbed. The men who wore the imperial purple in Nicaea carried the humiliation of loss upon their shoulders, but also the clarity that comes when illusions are gone. There was no time for decadence, no room for vanity. To survive meant to prepare, and to prepare meant to wait. Among these emperors stood men like John III, Ducas Vatatzes, remembered less for splendour and more for quiet strength. He was no emperor of endless treasure or vast armies, but of measured patience. In exile, he tended to the soil of the empire itself, encouraging agriculture, rewarding farmers, strengthening the backbone of his people. What once had been overlooked beneath the marble towers of Constantinople became the lifeblood of revival. Bread before glory, grain before jewels. And grain would feed soldiers, and soldiers would fight. Exile also taught diplomacy in a harsher school. Without the city's walls behind them, Byzantine emperors in Nicaea could not command with arrogance. They bargained with foreign kings, courted allies, arranged marriages with care, sometimes swallowing pride to secure breathing space. It was not the grandeur of envoys striding through Hagia Sophia's vast doors, but the quieter work of persuasion, a weaving of fragile bonds that might one day be tightened into chains of loyalty. And yet, exile did not mean surrender. In hidden halls, emperors spoke of the city still, of Constantinople as the heart that must one day beat again. They raised their sons and courtiers in the belief that what was lost could be taken back, that the empire was not dead but sleeping, waiting for the hour when it would wake. Each campaign, each treaty, each levy of troops was measured against that dream. The purple robe worn in Nicaea was tattered, but it carried the weight of destiny all the same. Soldiers who followed these emperors were hardened by their circumstances. They were not the pampered guards of a palace, but men who fought with the knowledge that their homes had been stolen, their churches desecrated, their families scattered. They were driven less by pay, often meagre or delayed, than by the burning need to reclaim. Such men could endure hunger, cold, and endless marches, because their fight was not abstract, it was personal. And emperors forged in exile learned to command them not with grandiose promises, but with shared endurance. Years passed, decades even, with Constantinople still under foreign hands. But exile had sharpened the empire into something leaner, tougher, less distracted by ornament. The city might have been stripped away, but its shadow stretched across the exiled court, reminding them of what awaited. The emperors of Nicaea rebuilt administration, nurtured scholars, and strengthened armies while the Latin occupiers grew complacent within Constantinople's crumbling splendour. Exile also carried lessons in humility. A ruler who has walked through foreign halls as a guest, who has bowed to necessity, who has eaten at tables not his own, knows the fragility of crowns. That knowledge would shape the future, for when the city was finally reclaimed, it would not be by men ignorant of suffering, but by those who had been tested in its fire. And so, from the barrenness of exile, strength was born. Constantinople might have been scarred, its relics stolen, its walls profaned, but in Nicaea, the empire's spirit was tempered like iron in flame. Each generation of rulers there inherited not marble palaces, but the will to endure. Not endless wealth, but the discipline of scarcity. Not the illusion of permanence, but the hunger to restore. When the tide began to shift, and the moment of return drew near, it was not by chance. It was the work of decades of quiet preparation, of emperors who had learned to see beyond themselves, who understood that survival alone was not enough. The empire could not live forever as a shadow. It had to return to its heart. And when the gates of Constantinople would open again, it would be at the command of men who had been shaped, not within the city's luxury, but outside its walls, hardened, patient, unyielding. The emperor who would one day walk back into Constantinople was not born of marble thrones or jewelled processions. He was forged in exile, tempered in the long silence of waiting, sharpened by necessity. And with him, Byzantium itself was being reshaped, ready not only to reclaim what was lost, but to rise from the ashes of humiliation into the strange, stubborn light of survival. The tide had turned, and now the hands that had once trembled in loss were steady on the reins of destiny. The empire's fate had always been tied to the water. Constantinople itself was a city half of stone and half of sea, balanced upon the meeting of continents, its heart beating to the rhythm of the Bosporus. No matter how high its walls, no matter how fierce its soldiers, without the waters it was incomplete. And on those waters lay one of the strangest, and most terrible weapons the world had ever seen. Something that seemed less invention than curse, less craft than sorcery. The Empire called it liquid fire. The world would remember it as Greek fire. It was not new, not in the 13th century when Byzantium plotted its return, but it was ancient enough, secret enough, that it seemed pulled from the pages of myth. Sailors told stories of it whispered in the dark, flames that clung to the sea, that ate wood and flesh with equal hunger, that water itself could not quench. Once lit, it burned until nothing was left but ash and memory. Its recipe was guarded like the Empire's soul, passed only from emperor to chosen keepers, locked away as though it were less a weapon than a living thing that might escape if handled carelessly. And yet, it was this weapon, this fire from the sea, that gave the Empire its teeth again. The Latin lords who had carved up Constantinople and grown comfortable behind its broken majesty believed their ships ruled the waters. They sent galleys heavy with plunder, sails full of arrogance, thinking the exiled empire could never challenge them. But on quiet nights, in hidden coves, Byzantine sailors were training once more. Rusting hulls had been patched, oarsmen drilled, and tubes of bronze, dragon-mouthed and silent until needed, were prepared to breathe death across the waves. The first time fire bloomed again, it came like a memory returning to life. An enemy fleet approached, expecting perhaps the clash of steel, perhaps the desperate ramming of lesser ships. What it met instead was silence broken by a sudden roar. A stream of liquid flame arched across the night, hissing as it struck wood, as it licked across sails, as it leapt from ship to ship. Men screamed as water betrayed them, offering no safety, the fire clinging even as they leapt overboard. Darkness was lit orange, and the sea itself seemed to burn. The legend of Byzantium was rekindled in those flames. No matter how far the empire had fallen, no matter how many provinces lost or treasures stolen, here was proof that it still carried something the world could neither copy nor destroy. Greek fire was not only a weapon, it was a declaration. The empire still had secrets. The empire still had power. News of the fire spread faster than fleets could sail. In the taverns of Venice, in the halls of Latin princes, in the camps of restless mercenaries, whispers grew again of the city that could command the seas. Fear travelled like smoke on the wind, and fear was sometimes more useful than victory. Enemies who might have pressed harder hesitated. Allies who might have faltered stood a little firmer. The flame burned beyond the waters, reaching into the minds of men who had never seen it, but who could picture the horror of a fire that laughed at the sea. It was not only battle that the fire served, but the spirit of the people. In Constantinople, still stripped and humiliated under Latin control, those who remembered the empire's past began to whisper that the sea was turning in their favour. In Nicaea, the exiled emperors held their heads higher, their cause no longer a hopeless dream, but a force with teeth. And for the sailors themselves, men who had once been dismissed as relics of a broken navy, each launch of flame was proof that they belonged to something greater than hunger and survival. They were not ghosts clinging to the wreckage of empire. They were its fire-bearers, but the flame was not infinite. Its mystery was as fragile as it was terrible. The recipe, known only to a handful, was as much art as science, demanding not just ingredients, but ritual, not just skill, but faith. Too little, and the fire sputtered. Too much, and it consumed its own vessel. Ships that bore it sailed with reverence, as though carrying a living god bound in jars and tubes. The fire gave Byzantium strength, but it also reminded them of the delicate balance upon which they stood. Too much reliance upon it, and they would grow careless. Too little, and they would lose the one thing that made the sea their ally. And so with care, the weapon was used not constantly, but decisively. It was unleashed in moments of greatest need, where one burst of flame could turn despair into triumph, where one fleet in ashes could shift the course of a campaign. More than once, the empire's enemies prepared to starve Constantinople by sea, only to find their ships ablaze before the siege could tighten. More than once, trade routes reopened because merchants believed the fire would protect them, because sailors swore they had seen enemies retreat without a fight at the mere rumour of its presence. Greek fire alone did not rebuild the empire. Ships must still be built, soldiers still paid, alliances still woven. But it lit the path forward, turning fear into a weapon as sharp as any sword. Fire on the sea gave back to the empire what had been stolen, dread in the hearts of its enemies, awe in the whispers of its allies, and above all, belief among its own people that the empire still had within it something no other power could match. The waters around Constantinople, once thought cursed by defeat, became again a stage for defiance. Flames dancing on the waves were more than destruction. They were resurrection, proof that the empire could not only endure, but strike. And in the light of that fire, men began to see the possibility of something greater. Not merely survival in exile, but return. Not merely defence, but conquest. The sea had always been Byzantium's mirror, reflecting its power, its wealth, its fragility. Now, in the fire that clung to it, the empire saw not fragility, but rebirth. And though the nights would still be long, though hunger would still gnaw, though battles still hung in the balance, one truth had been burned into the world's memory. Byzantium was not finished. It had fire from the sea, and with that flame, it would light the way back to its heart. The sea had given back its answer in flame, but a city cannot be reclaimed by fire alone. Ships could burn enemies, fleets could scatter. Yet the heart of an empire was not only defended on the water, it was carried on the shoulders of men who dared to march under a flag that many had thought buried. There comes a moment in the life of every people when survival ceases to be enough. The body may endure hunger, the walls may withstand assault, but the spirit demands more than mere existence. It demands a cause, a symbol, something to gather beneath. For Byzantium, that moment came when the old imperial banner, faded, tattered, and almost forgotten, was raised once more. It was not a banner of new conquest, not yet. The silk was not freshly woven, nor the colours vivid as they once had been. It was a standard carried from exile, patched and worn by time, marked by journeys across mountains and seas. Yet when it was lifted against the sky, men who had known only retreat for years stopped to look. And in that piece of cloth they saw not its wear, but its endurance. It was the double-headed eagle, wings spread to east and west, the ancient emblem of a power that had once called itself Rome. When the banner rose, it was less a signal of victory than of intent. For decades, Constantinople had been in the grip of foreign rulers who laughed in its palaces, who melted its relics for coin, who carried away its treasures like trophies. The citizens who remained lived beneath the weight of humiliation, unable even to dream of liberation. But banners are not raised for what already belongs. They are raised for what must be taken back. And so it was not in the city itself, but in the lands of exile, in Nicaea, that the old standard was unfurled once more. It is a strange thing, how cloth can command loyalty. Soldiers who had marched only for pay now marched for something larger. Farmers who had hidden their harvests now gave willingly, believing that the bread they baked would feed not only men, but destiny. Priests raised the banner in their prayers, binding faith to it, until its presence in processions and ceremonies seemed like a promise that God himself had not abandoned Byzantium. The moment of its raising was not marked by trumpets or great fanfare. It was quiet, almost fragile. A few soldiers in the dust, a few nobles gathered in exile, a few priests blessing what little remained. But word spread, as it always does, faster than any courier could ride. The banner had been lifted. The empire still claimed itself. And suddenly, what had been whispers of endurance became the first notes of defiance. Battles followed, of course. Skirmishes at the edges of Latin rule, pushes into lands once lost, villages reclaimed not by overwhelming force, but by persistence. At each such place, the banner was carried forward. On walls that had borne foreign colours, the double-headed eagle was raised again, ragged but defiant, and people wept to see it. To them, it was not simply a flag, it was memory, promise and hope, all bound together. Enemies mocked it at first, calling it a relic of a world that no longer existed, the desperate symbol of a state in tatters. But mockery cannot extinguish conviction. And when Latin knights saw villages rise against them at the sight of that banner, when mercenaries hesitated to fight against men who carried it with such burning belief, they began to understand that cloth alone can move armies. For the empire, the raising of the banner was not just for the world outside, it was for itself. Generals who had commanded men too weary to care now stood straighter. Soldiers who had thought themselves mercenaries found themselves part of something more. The banner was not wages, not rations. It was the bond that no hunger could erode, no exile could sever. And in time, its presence grew heavier with meaning. Victories gathered around it, small at first, then greater, until men began to swear that wherever the eagle flew, the empire would not fall. When towns fell, when walls were breached, when enemies were scattered, it was beneath the shadow of that standard. The battered silk became soaked in rain, in blood, in smoke, yet each stain seemed to strengthen rather than weaken it. It was as though the cloth itself carried the history of their struggle, each tear and burn a mark of legitimacy, proof that this was not the emblem of some fleeting power, but of one that had endured storms for centuries. Even the enemies of Byzantium grew uneasy in its presence. Latin lords who had thought themselves secure within Constantinople now heard stories of villages where peasants cheered at the sight of the eagle, of mercenaries who deserted their masters to fight under it, of allies shifting loyalties because they believed the old empire would rise again. Fear spread, not of armies alone, but of an idea made visible on a field of cloth. In Constantinople itself, where the banner could not yet be raised, rumours crept through the streets. Citizens whispered of its return, of how it had been seen on the distant battlefields, how it had been planted in soil long thought lost. These whispers became fuel for a city still under foreign chains. Men and women began to imagine, quietly, secretly, that the day might come when the banner would once again rise above the city's gates, when the wind would carry its shape over the Bosporus, visible for all to see. There is a moment when resistance ceases to be only survival and becomes a movement. That moment came with the raising of the banner. It was not the final triumph, not the fall of Constantinople's occupiers, not the end of the empire's suffering, but it was the first true step toward return, the shift from shadows into light. A people once bowed beneath despair now walked with their heads high, and all because of the courage to lift once more what others had abandoned. The banner was no longer cloth alone. It was Byzantium itself, ragged but unbroken, weathered but unyielding, scarred but still alive. And wherever it was carried, men began to believe that the empire was not finished. It was only waiting, gathering, preparing. And so, with each battle fought beneath it, with each village reclaimed, with each soldier who swore his life beneath its shadow, the empire drew closer to its heart. The banner had been raised once more, and with it the promise that the ashes of defeat were only the beginning of a greater fire. The banner was no longer just an emblem, it had become the heartbeat of a people. But a heartbeat, steady as it might be, cannot carry the body forward without effort. Byzantium had survived humiliation, had begun to gather itself, yet survival was not restoration. Between the lifting of the standard and the dream of Constantinople lay a long, uneven road, marked not by triumph after triumph, but by grueling years of persistence, compromise, and resilience. The land itself reflected that struggle. From the hills of Anatolia to the plains of Thrace, the empire's skeleton was scattered. Towns that once swelled with wealth had shrunk into half-empty villages. Strongholds that had defended Roman pride now stood cracked and weather-worn, their walls patched with whatever stone could be found. Roads that had once borne the march of legions were rutted, broken, overgrown. Yet along these same roads moved soldiers, merchants, and messengers carrying whispers of renewal. The march back was never swift. It was a campaign of patience, of slow reclaiming, one stone, one village, one oath at a time. Soldiers fought not only against men, but against time itself, against despair, against the inertia of ruin. There were victories that lifted hearts, but also defeats that nearly undid all progress. A single raid could undo a season's gains. A betrayal at a border outpost could open whole valleys to danger. But through all of this, the empire's will grew stronger. Nicaea remained the heart of this endurance. In exile, the imperial court learned again the art of necessity. Luxury was gone. Silver was rare. Silk, once abundant, became a treasure hoarded for embassies and ceremonies. The emperors of exile ruled not with grandeur, but with austerity, their courts smaller, their palaces humbler. Yet it was in this stripped-down existence that Byzantium began to sharpen itself anew. For the grandeur of the past had carried decadence, but the exile forged discipline. The long road back demanded not splendour, but tenacity. Armies were rebuilt not from endless wealth, but from careful bargaining. Mercenaries were still hired, but reliance on them waned. The core of the army became the men of the land, Anatolian peasants, hardened by labour, who fought with the knowledge that each step forward meant protection for their homes and families. The fleet too, once scattered, found renewal. Shipyards in exile towns worked tirelessly to shape planks into vessels, modest at first, but enough to patrol coasts and harass enemies. The empire did not yet command the seas as it once had, but it learned once more to respect and fear the power of water. Yet battles alone could not carry Byzantium forward. Diplomacy became as vital as steel. Exiled emperors and their envoys walked carefully among allies and rivals alike, weaving promises, marriages, and treaties. For on this long road, no step could be made without watching the shadows of greater powers, the Latins, the Seljuk Turks, the Bulgarians, each one watching the empire's slow movements with suspicion or hunger. Sometimes diplomacy bought time. Sometimes it brought betrayal. But in both, Byzantium endured. The march back was not only about territory, it was about memory. For each reclaimed town, each restored church, each monastery rebuilt, was a stitch in the torn fabric of identity. The people needed not only to live under the imperial eagle, but to believe in it again. And so, priests and monks became as crucial as generals. They carried the message of continuity, reminding peasants in remote valleys that their labour was not in vain, that they were still subjects of an empire not yet finished. In candlelit chapels, in whispered prayers, Byzantium lived on. But the road was long, and weariness always threatened. There were nights when soldiers camped in the mud, when rations dwindled, when the firelight revealed not determination, but exhaustion. Men wondered if the empire would ever truly return. Families displaced by war asked if they would see their homes again. And yet, morning always came. The march resumed. The banner was lifted. A weary people pressed forward. Every gain seemed fragile, as if the wind itself might take it away. A fortress retaken might be lost within months. A treaty signed might be broken within weeks. And yet, each time, Byzantium gathered itself, refusing to surrender. It was not an empire of overwhelming power anymore. It was an empire of resilience, one that could be knocked down, but not destroyed. And in this persistence, a kind of strength grew. The empire learned to live lean, to survive not on vast wealth, but on resourcefulness. Leaders became careful, calculating, wary of waste. Soldiers hardened into men who could march further and fight longer than those who opposed them. Towns grew accustomed to rebuilding, stone by stone, roof by roof, after each raid. Byzantium, once accustomed to grandeur, had become accustomed to endurance. And endurance, more than glory, was what the road demanded. At times the path forward seemed invisible, hidden behind defeats and disappointments. Constantinople still glittered in the distance, a jewel held by others, and the closer Byzantium drew, the more heavily guarded it became. Walls that had once protected the empire now kept it from its heart. And yet the thought of those walls stirred not despair, but determination. For an empire is more than its city. An empire is its people, its faith, its will to endure. And with each passing year, with each banner raised in defiance, with each step carved into the long road, the people carried that will forward. What made the road remarkable was not that it was filled with triumphs, but that it was filled with endurance despite so many obstacles. Empires often collapse when their wealth dries up, when their armies falter, when their enemies surround them. Byzantium, stripped of its wealth, its armies weakened, its enemies many, refused to collapse. It bent but did not break. It retreated, but it did not vanish. And so, inch by inch, year by year, the long road wound forward. There were moments of brightness. A fortress restored and held longer than expected. A treaty that held peace long enough to gather strength. A battle where the enemy was not only resisted but broken. Each such moment was a spark in the night, not enough to banish the darkness, but enough to guide the weary travellers onward. And always the banner, torn, patched, scarred, but still carried. It became the thread tying all of these moments together, a symbol that the road, however long, however hard, was leading somewhere. Each soldier who marched beneath it, each priest who blessed it, each villager who looked upon it with hope, knew that the long road was not without end. The empire had been cast down. It had been stripped of its jewel, its pride, its grandeur. But it had not been destroyed. It was walking the long road back, and with each the ashes of its past grew colder, while the flame of its future burned brighter. The road stretched still ahead, uncertain and perilous. But Byzantium had begun to move, and once begun, there was no stopping. For a people who could endure so much, there was no road too long. The road was long, and the empire had walked it with feet cracked and bloodied, But at last there came a moment when the air itself seemed to change. Byzantium, once gasping for survival, found within itself a second breath. Not the overwhelming roar of ancient grandeur, not yet the thunder of a conquering army, but the steady inhale of a people who had endured the suffocation of despair and chosen to rise again. This breath was not born in triumph. It was born in quiet resilience, in the patient accumulation of strength that no single victory could explain. After years of clawing back towns, of patching together fleets and armies, of forging fragile alliances with one hand while holding a sword in the other, the empire began to feel the weight upon its chest ease. For the first time in generations, it was no longer only surviving, it was recovering. The signs were subtle at first. Markets, once half deserted, began to stir with the noise of bargaining again. Merchants who had fled to safer havens returned, bringing spices, cloth, and stories of renewal. Workshops, whose tools had gathered dust, came back to life. Bells in churches rang not for funerals of soldiers and famine victims, but for festivals marking victories and harvests that were no longer entirely claimed by war. The army, too, changed in its bearing. The gaunt, hungry look of men who marched only out of duty gave way to something harder, steadier. These soldiers were still weary, but they were no longer broken. They carried themselves with the weight of men who had fought for survival, and found themselves not only alive, but advancing. Theirs was not arrogance, it was something firmer, something carved from the edge of ruin. The emperors of Nicaea, moulded in exile, understood this moment well. They had no illusions of grandeur. They knew that the empire was still scarred, still vulnerable, yet they also knew that within those scars was a strength no rival could match, the strength of endurance. It was one thing to hold an empire at its height, cushioned by wealth and security. It was another to guide it through the crucible of collapse and watch it breathe again. It was in this second breath that Byzantium found its rhythm. Campaigns were no longer desperate measures, but deliberate steps. Fortresses were not just held, but fortified. Garrisons not just stationed, but trained. Borders, once shifting daily under the pressure of raiders, began to harden. The empire was still small compared to what it had been, but it was compact, disciplined, alive. Enemies too began to notice. Where once they saw Byzantium as a carcass ripe for scavenging, now they saw something stirring, something dangerous. Campaigns against the empire grew costlier, their victories harder to claim. A fortress taken today might be lost tomorrow. A raid that once promised rich plunder now ended in blood and retreat. Rivals began to weigh the cost of their ambitions. Some hesitated, others turned to negotiation, for they sensed that the empire they thought buried was drawing its second breath. This renewal did not come without struggle. The road was still marked with betrayals, with defeats that reminded Byzantium of how fragile it remained. But each setback was met with resilience. Each wound healed into scar tissue that made the empire stronger. Slowly the balance began to tilt. Byzantium was no longer the hunted, it was once more the contender. And with this came something even more powerful than armies or fortresses: hope. In villages that had known only despair, people began to believe that their toil might build something lasting. Children grew up hearing not only of a golden past, but of a future that might yet be theirs. Priests spoke of divine favour, not as a memory, but as a promise. The people, long accustomed to bowing their heads in resignation, began to lift their eyes again. Hope is a fragile thing, yet once it takes root, it spreads faster than any army. It found its way into the whispers of merchants in marketplaces, into the chants of monks in monasteries, into the songs of soldiers marching at dawn. Hope turned hunger into endurance, fatigue into discipline, despair into defiance. It was the lifeblood of Byzantium's second breath. The empire, once hollowed out, began to feel substance returning to its bones. Taxes, though modest, flowed steadily enough to sustain armies. Grain harvests, no longer swallowed entirely by war, fed both soldier and civilian. Diplomacy, once a desperate scramble for survival, became a game in which Byzantium held its own, playing rivals against one another with the patience of a state that had endured centuries. This second breath did not mean Byzantium was safe. Far from it. Enemies still encircled it. Constantinople still stood in foreign hands, gleaming like a forbidden prize. But the empire was no longer staggering. It was striding. Each step was cautious, but it was firm. Each decision was weighed, but it was decisive. Byzantium had learned the hardest of lessons, how to breathe again after nearly drowning, and with that breath came vision. Where once the empire could think only of survival, now it dared to dream, not of impossible conquests or of the boundless dominion of old, but of a restored heart, a reclaimed capital, a reborn pride. Constantinople loomed ever larger in the minds of its people, not as a relic of loss, but as a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The long years of exile, the humiliation, the hunger, the endless struggle, all had led to this moment of renewal. Byzantium's enemies had expected it to vanish into the shadows of history, another fallen empire lost to memory. Instead, it stood again, breathing, enduring, waiting. And in that waiting, in that patient gathering of strength, there was power greater than any army could wield. For an empire that had already tasted death and yet continued to breathe was an empire that could not easily be destroyed. Byzantium's second breath was not just survival, it was the beginning of a return. The city still shone in the distance, its towers rising against the sky, its walls guarded by strangers. But the empire was no longer too weak to look upon it. Each day of endurance, each victory, however small, carried Byzantium closer. It had taken its second breath, and with it came the strength to finish the long road back. The city on the Bosporus had been given up for dead. Its fall had been mourned, its epitaph carved in the minds of those who believed empires were mortal like men, destined to leave behind only ruins and laments. Constantinople, once the queen of cities, had been written into the chronicles as a corpse. Pilgrims to its gates describe silence where there had once been hymns, weeds where there had once been marble avenues, foreign banners fluttering where the double-headed eagle once reigned. The world thought the city entombed, buried not beneath earth, but beneath humiliation, yet some cities are not so easily erased. Constantinople still breathed, faintly, like a heart that refuses to still itself, waiting for the day when hands would lift the stone from its chest. Byzantium had clawed its way back from exile and despair. The empire had found its second breath, had stitched its wounds into scars, had walked patiently along the road of endurance. Now all that strength, all that patience, all that relentless refusal to fade, converged on the city that had outlived its own tombstone. Constantinople was more than a capital. It was the body of Byzantium itself. Without it, the empire was a ghost. With it, the empire might yet live again. The years had turned Constantinople into a paradox. On the surface, it seemed a city occupied and diminished. Latin lords had ruled its palaces, stripped its treasures, and filled its churches with unfamiliar rites. The population had thinned. Neighbourhoods had collapsed into dust. But beneath that decay lay something untouchable. For the city's stones still remembered the empire that had built them. Its walls, though cracked, still stood like guardians waiting for the return of their true master. Its harbour, though filled with ships of strangers, still opened into the same waters that had carried the fleets of Rome. Constantinople, though treated as a possession, was never truly possessed. The exiled empire understood this. Each campaign, each alliance, each victory along the long road back had been a step toward the city. Even when the name was not spoken, every soldier who raised a spear, every craftsman who hammered a nail into a rebuilt fortress, knew where their labour pointed. The city was the unspoken destination, the inevitable conclusion. It had been stolen, but it had not been buried. And so the empire gathered itself for the return, not with reckless haste, but with the patience it had learned in exile. Armies were assembled, fleets prepared, alliances tested. The task was monumental, for Constantinople was no ordinary city to besiege. It was a fortress of walls and waters, a place that had defied empires for centuries. Yet those same walls that had turned aside Persians and Arabs, Avars and Bulgars, now stood under foreign banners, weakened by neglect. The Latins who held the city had neither the strength nor the unity to wield it as Byzantium once had. Their rule was a shadow, and shadows cannot hold back the dawn forever. The campaign to reclaim the city unfolded not as a single thunderclap, but as the slow gathering of a storm. Byzantine soldiers marched not with shouts of conquest, but with the silence of inevitability. Their eyes were fixed on the horizon, on towers they had once thought lost forever. In villages along the way, people lit candles and whispered prayers, for they knew what this march meant. The empire was not merely expanding, it was reaching for its heart. The siege came with both fear and faith. To face those walls was to face centuries of history, for every stone seemed to speak of past glories and defeats. Yet the empire did not falter. Its ships closed the waters. Its armies ringed the land. Days turned into nights, nights into weeks. Each assault tested both sides, but the defenders were weary, their spirit fractured, while the attackers carried with them not only weapons, but the weight of destiny. And then, the walls that had outlived empires opened not for their occupiers, but for their true heirs. Whether by steel, by stratagem, or by the silent hand of fate, the city yielded. The banners of foreigners fell, and once more, the double-headed eagle rose above its gates. Constantinople had not been resurrected. It had simply waited for its rightful master to breathe life into it again. The return was not the triumphant parade of golden legions or endless treasure. It was quieter, heavier, more profound. Soldiers stepped into streets half forgotten. Priests returned to altars stripped bare. Citizens who had never known an emperor of their own tongue wept at the sight of the eagle unfurled. The city was battered, scarred, diminished, yet in that moment it was alive again. It is said that cities are like men, born, living and dying. But Constantinople defied this truth. It had been declared dead more than once, carved onto the tombstone of history. And yet, like the empire it embodied, it refused the grave. Its walls, its harbour, its domes, they endured, waiting for breath to return. In reclaiming the city, Byzantium did not conjure a miracle out of nothing. It merely reclaimed what had never truly vanished. The empire, restored to its capital, was not the vast dominion of Justinian or Basil. It was smaller, leaner, marked by scars. But it was alive, and that life itself was the greatest triumph. To fall is common among empires. To rise again from the ashes, to breathe when the world has written you off, is the rarest of victories. Constantinople stood once more as the beating heart of Byzantium, a city that had been written into its own epitaph, yet had outlived the stone meant to mark its grave. The Latins had ruled it, chroniclers had mourned it, enemies had rejoiced in its fall. But in the end, it endured. And in that endurance, the empire found its soul again. The story of Byzantium's greatest comeback was never about invincible armies or endless wealth. It was about survival, patience, endurance, and the refusal to vanish when all the world expected disappearance. The city that had been buried in memory had clawed its way back into life, carried on the shoulders of a people who would not accept its death. And so the city that outlived its tombstone stood once more, scarred but unbroken, diminished but unbowed. The fires of its lamps burned again in Hagia Sophia. The voices of its people echoed again through its streets. The waters of the Bosporus kissed its shores as they had for 1,000 years. Constantinople lived, and in its survival, so too did Byzantium. The grave had been prepared, the epitaph carved, but the city refused to lie in it. Some places are too deeply rooted in history to be buried. Some empires are too stubborn to die. And so the city on the Bosporus, the city of Constantine, the city of the double-headed eagle, rose once more, not as a corpse reanimated, but as a heart that had never truly stopped beating. It was not the same empire, it was not the same city, but it was alive, and that was enough to defy history itself. And now, as the story quiets, let's take a breath together. We've drifted through an empire that should have faded, that seemed a ghost so many times, and yet found ways to linger. We saw walls that held against storms, seas that carried both fire and salvation, and a people who lived as though survival itself was a victory. What stayed with you most in this journey? Was it the marble domes shining above a city under siege? The strange fire that burned across the water? Or perhaps simply the stubbornness of a people who would not let history close the book on them? Each of these moments is part of a larger truth, that sometimes the greatest story is not of winning, but of refusing to end. I'd love to hear what stood out for you tonight. Share it in the comments below, and together we'll trace how each of us sees a different part of this long road through the past. If you found yourself carried by this quiet corner of history, let it follow you into the night. And before you drift off, take a moment to subscribe. It's the easiest way to keep these forgotten voices alive, and it means you'll always have another story waiting for you when you need it most. Until next time, sleep well, dream deeply, and remember being be the past do show for